Good afternoon and welcome back to this RUSI day on thinking about how we do our national security strategy. My name's Suzanne Raine and I'm a trustee at RUSI. I was formerly a member of the UK national security community. It's great to be here. We're going to use this session this afternoon to look in more detail at the how, look at those skills which we think government needs in order to meet its objectives, and ask how any of that might work in practice. Is government making the best use of the skills of the civil servants it already has? And if it isn't, what does it really need to train them in? How might government create a new kind of relationship and means properly to draw on the expertise and know-how of business and industry? We've talked about it seemingly infinitely, and yet it still lacks a sort of tangible, practical way of working. We talk a lot about the need to be able to reach out and collaborate during crises. Obviously, that's the focus at the moment, but how can we incorporate this in such a way that we're using those skills in order to avoid the crises, which would be even better? So joining me are two brilliant people who hopefully have all the answers. Elisabeth Braw is Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an Associate Fellow at RUSI. Elisabeth has been a leading thinker on the question of national resilience, and she's going to talk today on working with business and industry in order to sort of deliver national security priorities, and in particular look a little bit more in detail about the question of civilian reserves. And Air Marshal Ed Stringer was until last month Director General of the UK Defence Academy and Joint Force Development. He was an integral part of the drafting of the integrated operating concept, and he's going to talk about the military experience of educating and training the cohort. The way this is going to work, Elisabeth's going to speak first for about 15 minutes, followed by Ed, and then we'll come back to me, and the three of us will have a short discussion between us, and then I will put to them the questions that you, the audience, put in the Q&A box. So, so please start typing in there. Elisabeth, you go first.
Thank you, Suzanne, and it's nice to see both names that I know and names I don't know, because the point of this event and the whole day is obviously to share ideas beyond the circle of usual suspects. So I wanted to mention a couple of companies first that have been in the news recently. One is Ryanair, which nobody needs to be reminded of what happened to that flight between Athens and Vilnius. Then H&M, which was a few weeks ago, found itself boycotted by China. And why would anybody boycott H&M? We all like H&M clothes, or maybe not everybody on this call, but at least the next generation. And lots of people around the world love H&M. It found itself boycotted by China for reasons inexplicable to H&M. Then we have Australian winemakers who have, as we all know, been likewise boycotted by China, which was a retaliation against the Australian government. And what's easier when you want to punish another country's government than to punish its businesses, because those businesses have for the past 3 decades been expanding internationally. That was a strategy that made business sense. It was also a strategy that made sense from a national economic perspective, because business success means greater prosperity for us at home. And the reason, of course, H&M was boycotted, we should point out, even though it was never explained, because it's in the mystery of things, of geopolitics today. The reason that H&M was boycotted may have something to do with something that H&M may have said last year, but most likely was a retaliation against the Swedish government for excluding Huawei from its 5G network. And for the same reason, 5G and Huawei, China has been threatening the UK that Chinese companies could pull out from joint business projects here in the UK, including Hinkley Point and HS2. And we have also seen what happened to Ericsson, also as a result of the Swedish 5G decision, which means that now Ericsson is essentially being coerced by, or not essentially, is being coerced by the Chinese government and by Huawei to lobby on behalf of Huawei in Sweden, and has also been told that it could lose its access to the Chinese market or could lose its Chinese customer base. So the question is, these are completely vanilla companies, innocent and with no political agenda, and then that raises the question, who will be next? Whether the answer is that nobody knows, and that this is a completely new reality for companies. Every single company, every single CEO makes decisions on a regular basis about next steps, or where to expand, where to withdraw from markets, and all of that is based on a risk calculation. And I remember back when I worked in the private sector in risk consultancy, there were constant such cases where a company was about to enter a new market or acquire another company through an merger and acquisition. But these were company-related risks, and those you can measure, you can calculate, well, does it make sense, does it not make sense, and then you make your decision. And what we're seeing now are companies being targeted because they happen to be based in a particular country, and if that country takes a decision that is unpalatable to another country, that country can choose to retaliate against companies from that country because they have a global footprint. And of course, if the country that wishes to engage in retaliation happens to be China, then in most cases, those companies are desperately dependent on the Chinese market for their bottom line and for their profits. So what has happened until now is that consultancies have been providing advice, risk advice to companies, and that's fine, but the advice that they provide is tactical. It is about entering new markets, and it's about choosing new partners and acquisition targets. But consultancies are recruited or are brought in on a tactical basis when a company has something it wants to know. It doesn't provide that long-term strategic advice, and it's not even possible for consultancies to provide that advice, because often this is information that only governments have. And on the other hand, companies are globally operating companies from the UK and elsewhere have insights that not even governments have. And for example, you will all know a British shoe company, an iconic brand. Well, an executive from this shoe company that will remain nameless, but was recently sold to a Chinese buyer. An executive there recently told me about something that happened a few years ago when this company was going to renew its lease on its office in China, and it was an annual lease, and it was coming up for renewal, and there had been no problem until then. Well, all of a sudden there was a problem, and it couldn't be remedied, and so the company had to vacate the premises. And the conclusion that this company came to was that this company was no longer desired in China, because China was moving away from footwear to more technologically sophisticated products. And that leaves CEOs in a position of really considerable confusion, because who are they going to turn to for advice about how, or for insights, for discussion about how geopolitics is likely to affect their companies? There is nobody. And we have to remember that being a CEO is an extremely lonely profession, because there is really nobody you can have these frank conversations with. So, and I remember a couple of years ago, a CEO in the paper and pulp business, which is again a global sector, that globally operating sector that is completely unglamorous, but that powers our daily lives without us knowing it. And he said, I am getting all these reports. I read the Financial Times every day, but what I want to know is how to steer my company through this turbulent period. And there is nobody who can tell him. So what I want to propose, and what I have proposed and written a paper about, that I have been asked to talk a little bit about, is government consultations with business leaders at the CEO level. One form of consultations with people at the CEO level, CEOs and chairmen, and then another form of consultations with other C-suite executives, the CISOs and the like. And this plan, I think, would fit in very nicely to what you just mentioned, Suzanne, which is the UK's plan to set up a civilian reserve. It was mentioned in the integrated review, and I think we are all enthusiastic about it and are applauding the UK for taking this step, which will be fantastic for the UK, but will also mean that the UK will leapfrog the countries that are usually ahead of the curve and are still ahead of the curve on resilient societal resilience, which are the Nordic countries and now also the Baltic countries. So when I wrote this paper, I went around London, or not went around London physically. I had Zoom conversations with executives from across UK PLC, and not just in critical national infrastructure, but in other sectors as well, because as we have seen with H&M, even lowly companies not considered strategic, if they are targeted, that can have a detrimental effect on the country and the national economy. So I want to give you an idea of what the executive said. So here is, for example, a top executive in the telecoms business. And he explained that there is some engagement with the UK government on cyber threats, and this company is told, this company and other companies are told when there is something they should pay attention to. And he said, the thing we don't necessarily see is what is the UK's intent if we, meaning the UK, offensively go after Russia. If we had regular exchanges with the government, then at least industries could say, what are the assets that we need to harden? And with that information, we and others would be able to harden our assets, which would also harden the UK's defense. Then from the aviation sector, a top executive there told me, we thoroughly support what you're outlining. There are currently pockets of national security excellence engagement within the government. What currently also works well is if you know someone within the government, you can reach out to them and get good engagement. And sometimes someone in the government will organize a meeting, but again, it's not regular, systematic. At the moment, whenever there's engagement from HMG, it's because I happen to know an ambassador and ask him or her to come and speak, and the Department for Transport shares specific risks updates with us as well. HMG has a lot of expertise and well-informed analysis, but there is no concerted effort to make it available to business. And the engagement depends on someone knowing someone in the government. And lastly, here's a top financial services executive, meaning banking. And I'll read a long passage here because this person made so many excellent points that are connected. And so this person said, the need for this kind of engagement is very much on UK PLC's radar and has been for some time, both regarding specificities of national security threats facing our sector and others, and strategically. The basis of any country's strength is its companies, so the most effective way of weakening a country is clearly to attack its private sector. And the new national security threats we're seeing today will clearly be with us for some time. But I'm not sure the government has wrapped its arms around it. We need to think about civil defense in a way that they haven't done for some years. And I'll insert here myself, that is, again, an endorsement of the Civil Reserve that was announced in the integrated review. And then he continues, in our sector, we have resilience when it comes to AML, meaning anti-money laundering, fraud, and so on, but those are silos. We need comprehensive resilience. We need to look at defense of our frontline companies, both in protecting them from economic espionage, where there's already engagement from the government, and issues such as disruptions of their operations. Today, government experts have such conversations with security teams in large FTSE companies, but those are conversations between technical experts, not strategic conversations involving executives. What I would love to see is for the scale of the national security problem to be set out, and for the nature of the conversation to shift from not just being expert to expert, and for civil defense to also include UK PLC. During World War II, if your factory was bombed, you knew that the RAF was up there trying to shoot down those bombers, and you knew the government would help you to get production back. Today, it's clearly not World War II, but a similar engagement simply is not happening. And so returning back to me now, these comments and many other comments included in the report show that there's enormous appetite across UK PLC for engagement with the government, and not, this is not about selling goods or services. This is about an exchange of information on a basis of mutual trust, and as we have seen, also the option, the possibility of participating in the civil reserve. Now, of course, devil's advocates would say that, of course, companies would love this because they would get insights from the governments that they can't get elsewhere. But the point is that they can share, they have invaluable insights from the front lines of the globalized economy that they can share with the government and with their peers, because all companies face the same reality, and it's in their interest to engage openly with our peers. But that exchange won't happen just because there's a meeting, a once-off meeting. Will only happen once there's a regular contact and a regular exchange, and that will build trust, and the information will flow freely as a result of that. And again, we have to remember that CEOs are lonely creatures. They have to decide without being able to have a frank conversation with a lot of people at all. And we also have to remember that this is not just a UK specific problem. And I mentioned previously the Nordic and Baltic countries that have been doing things for decades now. But another example of how the debate and action is shifting is the Czech Republic, which has been far behind the curve on societal resilience, but is now conducting gray zone exercises led by the MOD and involving the private sector and defensive gray zone scenarios. So they have done 2 exercises and will continue with companies in different sectors. And then one more thing is that corporate attitudes are changing. So, well, first of all, I should say, this sort of engagement, clearly the invitations should happen on a transparent basis, so that it's not, there could be no suspicions that any companies are getting any advantages. But it's, again, it's not just the government giving it, it would be the government receiving information. So, and again, no commercial arrangements would be discussed, because it would be strategic discussions. And again, coming back to the point that corporate attitudes are changing. So just this morning I had 2 breakfasts, so I feel amply caffeinated. And at the first breakfast, I spoke with an executive from the tech sector who had contacted me to say, to discuss how his sector can help the government by putting their cyber experts at the government's disposal free of charge. And the second breakfast I had was with a financial services executive who said that these days, if a new recruit, meaning young banker, would join them and start talking about profits as the ultimate objective of that company, senior executives would tell him or her that that's just not the way the world works anymore, even in a cutthroat business like financial services. So with that, I'll hand the floor back to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And I'm going to come to questions after Ed has spoken, I think, and then we can loop everything together. So you did talk about in the war, everyone always knew the RAF was up there to help them. So now we're hoping that Air Marshal Stringer will demonstrate that in real life.
Suzanne, thank you very much for giving me my 1940 moment. And Elisabeth, thank you for teeing me up so perfectly, because it's actually an image I've used myself when we've been talking about 5-domain integration, trying to explain the differences of the modern world. Used exactly that. When the RAF defended the environment of the air, everything within UK airspace, whether it was public or private sector, was protected. And when the only way you could attack the signalling of British Railways was via the Luftwaffe, then there was a perfect convergence there. As we now know, with 5 domains, space and cyber, there are many other attack vectors now that use elements of critical national infrastructure, actually completely owned by the private sector. And it does throw out some very interesting questions, and that's what we'll talk about here. A little bit about the Defence Academy, because I'll refer to that later on in my remarks, and I'm conscious that not everybody in the audience, even though the Defence Academy has cropped up and but several other previous speakers this morning will know what we're talking about. Those in London have probably bounced around the Royal College of Defence Studies on Belgrave Square, a small part of the Defence Academy, but with big international presence. And the main campus is down at Shrivenham, where a range of staff college courses are run that might be thought of as teaching the arts and sciences of command, leadership and management of the military instrument in peace and war, with an academic framework, but also using practical wargaming and exercises to bring home the reality. Appended to that were a bunch of technical schools aimed at people of the lower ranks. And there's something in the nomenclature here. We had a staff college, but a technical school. And that was seen as a bit below the salt. And the staff college saw itself as very much Russell Group. The technical school was rather polytechnic. And we have set about to change that over the last 3 years. So the commandant, yes, runs what you might see more of the humanities side of the arts and sciences of the staff college, but now a greatly enhanced technical side, including the Defence Cyber School, which has been expanded now into a full information warfare group, working very closely with the agency, but especially, obviously, GCHQ in all aspects of information warfare, research into artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, etc., etc. The aim being to turn, and this will be important later on, the site from being something that really, I think all of us and military people in the audience will know what I'm talking about here, where people will put through rote courses to see whether they could get close to producing the pinks, the preferred and accepted solution, to something that looks much more like the sort of research-based campus that you would see if you went around any other of the universities in that sector of the UK. But of course, at the high end of what all institutions, whether it's RCDS in London or the High Command and Staff course, ultimately what we are looking at is really military strategy within the context of national strategy and understanding all the dimensions therein. And of course, then that links me now to what we're talking about here, because strategy is what the integrated review set out to talk about and define strategy. Now, I'm not going to fall in the trap of lecturing this audience on strategy. I know the wave of antibodies that's released when military people try and tell everyone else what strategy is and that they don't understand it. And I'm very pleased that wonderful speakers like Laurie have been all ready to talk about that. What I will say is, in my mind, strategy has always been a doing thing. It's the link between your declaratory policy and the actions you actually take. And even if, and I have worked with some military people who refuse to have a strategy, I've always pointed out your strategy can be revealed because people will assess the actions you took, and that will reveal what your strategy was. And interesting in this day, the idea's cropped up already, in these days of big data and artificial intelligence and natural language programming, I think organizations and their structures that often lead them to make decisions in certain ways can have their strategies revealed because you can now monitor them very closely. It is quite possible that our competitors really understand us and our decision making better than we understand it ourselves, a slightly frightening thought. But I think there is such a thing as grand strategy, and I think John, who's coming on later on, I think his team have done a wonderful job with the integrated review, and I want to build on what Peter Rickett said, which is to suggest that we probably need to keep John Bew, and John is still there in the number 10 policy unit, to keep his organisation going, because I'm with Peter on this. The national security strategy, if it's going to be the coordinating brain across departments, needs, as Laurie said, to be able to do evaluation. It needs to see where our strategies are at the moment, because as we all know, as Moltke has reminded us, and we keep on quoting, the enemy has a vote. And therefore, as soon as you make any action, you take action, there will be a reaction. And that's why strategy is never a plan. But someone has to pull all the dimensions in. And I'm very pleased that China's cropped up already, because I think it's only in the last couple of years that the broader polity in this country, arguably the West, has realized just what a coordinated campaign of being successful in the international environment has been put together very deliberately by China. All I'll say is pretty much everything is dual use, and Elisabeth has brought out the fact that H&M probably never thought they'd be on the front line of competition in the international domain. I would argue that the departure of culture and media and sport never really realized it was a national security department either a few years back, and 5G has and Huawei has shown just how pivotal those things are in the modern environment. So what I'm getting at here is we do need a whole of government approach, And as Laurie said, you need practitioners. There's no point in coming out with beautiful ideas and plans and strategies if they're just not practical and can't be achieved. So I'm going to suggest that strategy and action is a continual dialogue between the higher brain of the organisation and the neural matter of all those executive functions below. It's a continuing conversation of evaluation, of assessing action and reaction, and government needs a machine to do it. And that machine, therefore, does need to be, to use a very simple word, it does need to be trained. And all those people involved in it, and someone, I think it was Laurie, was talking about moving quickly, and Michael Gove at the start talked about exercising, which I'll come back to, and the need to, in an environment of trust, move information around very quickly around government to allow you to make quick and speedy decisions. And that means across this whole complex piece now, and we've already introduced the private, the public sector government, and I will argue international allies. All that somehow has to work within a shared understanding. Now, how do we do that in the military? Well, we talk about interoperability, and we break interoperability down into three things. The first is, and forgive me for the military context, but does your equipment work together? And of course, the equipment of intelligence sharing, of command and control has to knit together. So there's a technical element of interoperability. But the other two are much softer, and I think play into what we're talking about today. The first is to have a shared body of concepts and doctrine to understand what it is that you're all trying to achieve, and to understand across the totality of your organisation your ways and approaches. Relatively easy to do in the military. We publish doctrine, people read it, people sign up to it. Very interesting that those non-NATO nations who are now associated with the JEF have probably read more NATO doctrine than most British officers, and certainly seem to know it backwards, where some of ours perhaps aren't quite as familiar as they might be. But nevertheless, there is codified doctrine. Once again, as Mortka tells us, it might only last to the first day of the conflict. So you need to be permanently on top of generating concepts and ideas. That's what Joint Force Development was set up to do. And that is what the continual evolution of John Bew's organisation in doing the integrated review in practice will have to become. And the third element then is trust, which is, if you're moving quickly, you have to know and understand and have an interpersonal relationship with everyone, with certainly those people you'll interface with regularly, and by extension, those whose information, whose data, whose actions you may be relying on. And in the military context, then that might well be a reliance that results in life and death. And it's not hyperbolic to say that. And that's why trust is so important. And so I want to simplify all that down really in getting at those into the three E's, where I'm not going to use Tony Blair's education, but it is education, experimentation, and exercises. And that's where the Defence Academy comes in with the staff colleges. As I've outlined, we're moving those now to be much more research-based, and if you like, be the intellectual engine to feed the experimentation processes, which I'm going to come on to in a minute, for defence. But very little we do in the staff colleges is purely military. And I was struck in my last week in the job only a month ago, taking two of our most eminent judges around, chief justices, because it doesn't matter why they were going around there. But as I showed them around the site, it was amazing how the linkages came out within the first sentence or two of conversations, just in the defence cyber school, cybercrime, the problems of attribution, the problems of state and non-state actors, etc. And you could admit there's a fantastic conversation developed between these two eminent judges and the relatively junior military and civilian staff who are manning the defence cyber school. It just brought home how connected our thinking and our worlds are. And that's before I fold in the GCH Q folk who were down there. Now, we all know that our staff colleges are joint, and that's not necessarily true in a lot of other countries. The Americans have 14 staff colleges, the services have their own as well as the joint one, so we are quite lucky in that sense. And they are international. 70% of the students at RCDS come from overseas, and 2/5 of the course, the year-long course for middle-ranking officers, what's known as the senior course at Shrivenham, come from overseas. 59 countries represented on the course, which is vital for building those networks and also building the understanding and trust that I spoke about. And I know from personal experience, I've turned up in parts of the world at the early stage of operations when all is chaos and confusion, and I've recognized faces in the room from exercises and staff colleges, various around the world. It does work. Now, all of those courses have built in the private sector from the UK one way or another, but I'd argue it's been a little bit ad hoc. And I was a student in RCDS in 2009, and for the last third of the course, the strategic phase, industry put students in who were a little bit more than part-time, but 2 or 3 days a week. But it's only really the big primes that could afford to do it. And you're not necessarily getting the tech startups. And it wasn't part of a program that I could see where the right companies were selected, and we had enough depth, as we have with international overseas students, to build the relationship of which I spoke. Now, Peter Ricketts spoke earlier on about it's difficult for the civil service to do these, take a whole year off like the military do. But part of what we've done in the staff college in digitising it is not just to teach about the digital world, it's to be it. Not many people know that if you measure the points of academic presence, if you like, it's not quite students, but the people taking courses. There are whatever metric you use, there are 80,000 more of them for the Defence Academy than there is for the Open University. When COVID struck, we put the operational planning course that's given to the most junior army course, basic battle procedures, if you like, online, and it was downloaded 4,000 times by people who were looking to set up COVID-related activities, improve and speed up logistics, etc., etc. This is another thing that could be done much more systematically, and it allows for that sense now of learning at the point of need. Not just targeting the top 20% for the advanced course and the high command staff course, the top 1% of the military. Now that education can go to everyone who needs it, regardless of rank, regardless of point in their career, education at the point of need, done remotely, online, with then perhaps the sort of pointed 2 or 3 day interventions, which pretty much every organisation can afford if the benefits are indeed made manifest. And I would argue that has to include industry. If people haven't read Brad Smith, president of Microsoft Tools and Weapons, go read that. It will show you how Microsoft essentially had at some point had become the effective cyber agent of the US government with NotPetya and WannaCry, etc., etc. So we have to work with these organizations very closely and very deliberately, which brings me on to experimentation, because you can't suddenly go and sit down in bed with these companies and say, we've got a problem in cyberspace, how do we resolve it? By the way, who are you? That sense of teamwork needs to be there from the start. We set up in Joint Force Development a program called Integrated Warrior, and I think quite a few people even in the military looked at it and said, well, that's just experimentation on the bits of kit the military is going to need in the future. Well, yes, it is that. There are people looking at new ways of doing command and control. There's reconnaissance drones, logistic drones, etc., etc. But in our mind, it was always something much more than that, because if you look at the integrated operating concept and the integrated review, it talks, as Elisabeth just has, about resilience. So I saw hooking up with these companies, 122 at the launch event, was not just to pick their brains over developing the next generation or two of equipment, but it was to fold them into our exercise plans and say, what are our concepts for resilience? Because national resilience is your resilience. It's not just the military here. It's that idea about protecting the airspace versus protecting cyberspace. So Integrated Warrior was always much more of a comprehensive wrapper around pulling together academia, the military, and industry as 3 strands of a rope of resilience. And the final element there is exercises. Once you've got your concepts and if you've educated everybody, you need to prove the machine. As Michael Gove said, you need to exercise so that people have confidence and they can roll out the processes and they become second nature. And then that business of strategy, actually making decisions, understanding what's going on at the coalface, but also the higher level policy, and therefore prioritizing your decisions. Strategy in action is all about choices and prioritization. Can't be done if the team comes together for the first time when there's a crisis. When we were in the middle of a Cold War, we had a thing called Wintex. We had from ministers down to local government what we would do in the event, at the worst case, the apocalyptic nuclear exchange. But why don't we do that now when we need to be testing things such as pandemic preparedness? That's in the forefront of everyone's minds at the moment. But massive cyber attacks, or even as in the news recently, a once in every 100 years solar flare that does the same thing as a cyber attack, is the sort of event that we could be preparing for through a exercise serial. And I will just repeat what Elisabeth said before. The Czechs have thought this through and actually thought through now doing grey zone exercising. And that's something that I think that we really ought to look at copying. So if those are, and in conclusion, if those are the 3 E's, education, experimentation and exercising, just a couple of thoughts to close. I think all those will be greatly enhanced if we have more fluid HR policies across the private and public sector. Reserves has cropped up a lot at the moment. I use reserves a heck of a lot I used in my old organisation, especially those from the city who understand threat finance and economic levers. Go find the doctrine, it's at .gov.uk. It's an excellent document. It's been downloaded by all our allies and it's class leading. It shows what clever use of reservists can do. And those reservists don't need to come from the military. So this idea of reservists from across the civil service who can be pulled back in to bolster resilience, I think is marvellous. And I think we need to look at what some of the individual services have done, whether it's the Engineering Logistics Support Group or 601 Squadron in the Royal Air Force, which is bringing in big hitters from the private sector to understand what the military are doing, and at various moments, and crisis is obviously one, step up to offer that advice, be interlocutors, to have already started to have the various conversations. And of course, that Wintex program would fold all these organisations in. It was, after all, the Engineering, Logistics and Support Group that were behind the very rapid rollout of the Nightingale hospitals for this pandemic. Other ideas, part of the Joint Force Development work for the last 2 years was to sponsor a absolutely globally leading technology for a single synthetic environment. And the first person I took that to was not actually defence, it was Mark Sedwill as the NSA, arguing that a national digital twin that models the UK and all its functions and layers, social media, infrastructure, cyber, etc., would be a marvellous synthetic ground for us to be working on national resilience and pull all the strands of government together. And I would just say that the limited work that's been done since 2015, which hasn't cropped up in earlier remarks, a little surprised, the RCDS has run the Virtual National Security Academy for a while. It takes, at the 1-star level, courses of about 30 to 40 for 3 to 4 days. The likes of the National Security Advisor, the Vice Chief, CDS come and talk to the course, and they discuss their shared approaches to the geostrategic challenges of the day. It's the best validated course that I ran, probably because a lot of the people from non-defence departments in government don't get the opportunity to do that sort of thing. But it shows me the market is there and already made. And I think the idea of the National Security Academy now needs to build on that, as we've done with the Defence Academy, to build, as I know Michael Cove is keen on and others in government, that information warfare group, if you like, the technological element of it, which people like Anthony Finkelstein has been looking at and we've been working with Pamela. So we have both the National Security Staff College to think through policy and strategy making, as Laurie talked about, but also a technical academy as well, such that the 83% humanities graduates currently in the fast track of the civil service can get themselves educated in the practices, as Laurie and Malcolm talked about earlier. Understanding statistics, understanding data, understanding tech is going to be important for policy making. It's going to be important just to be an intelligent customer when you deal with the private sector, for the reasons that we've all, I think, discussed and agreed earlier on. So lots of things out there. The National Security Academy, programs like Integrated Warrior, they now need putting on steroids, rationalising, agreeing across government, and the National Security Advisor, I think, is the man who, and it is a man at the moment, who is perfectly placed to pull all this together. I think I've overrun slightly. Apologies, Suzanne, back to you.
Fine, thank you. I think listening to you and Elisabeth speak, the word rationalising is going to be a critical one for the government to work out what we're doing, because there are so many parts of this that actually overlap. And I was thinking, as you were both talking, there's still the really unresolved question about practically how do you engage with business? Which business do you engage with? Which part of government does it? Do you have a centralised bit? Do you decentralise it? Do you integrate, as you discussed, Ed, do you integrate business into your training? So do you open the College for National Security up to, British industry in some way? How do you then choose how to do that? Who decides how you choose how to do that? Is that the Cabinet Office? So there's a whole load of things which require deep thought in order to sort of organize them. I was going to start with a question. A lot of my questions are going to have the question of knowledge running through them, because it seems to me that we talk a lot about strategy, but you can't actually make strategy without a good understanding of what the situation is, what's going on. And that requires you to invest in knowing stuff, not just collecting data, but knowing it. And I noticed, Elisabeth, from a lot of what you're saying, that when you're talking to CEOs, what they're asking from government is analysis. And that builds on a relationship which has existed over many years, which is essentially handing over threat assessments, talking particularly to critical national infrastructure companies about the risks that they're on. Are there expectations on that unrealistic? Because that would require government to be in a position to produce load-bearing assessments of all of those risks for businesses to use. And then flipping the other way, are there structures? Clearly, there's an awful lot of work to do in government to divest the sort of relation with industry from the questions about procurement and preference, which is where sometimes they've got bogged down in the past. So that's a huge question, which you can take in multiple different ways. But I think my critical concern is that industry is still looking for analysis. Government has disesteemed analysis and understanding in favour of strategic thinking and policy making, without realising that the one depends on the other. And if we've got to get this relationship with business right, what do we need in order to do that?
Yes, I think, Suzanne, the most important point to remember is that companies don't want and they don't need classified updates. I mean, the critical ones already get classified updates, and that's fine. But they. So I'm a pastor's daughter. I don't know if anybody else remembers the passage in the Bible where Philip says, "I read, but I don't understand what I read," and so. It's like that for companies. They have all this information, both classified from the government and what they read in the Financial Times every day. But they need somebody to help them make sense of it. And it's not because they're stupid or poorly informed otherwise. It's because no CEO can keep track of the entirety of what's going on in the world and the intricacies with which governments and non-state actors interact with one another. So, and governments really rather uniquely have this expertise. And yes, you said, Suzanne, that what the UK government has is not perfect, but it's still a whole lot better than what companies can establish and achieve on their own. And so that's and that's what they are looking for. And also, in a sense, that's an advantage, because how would you run these briefings or consultations or conversations if it was a bunch of classified information that was being delivered, and how do you then handle companies? Well, how do you handle the selection of participants? Whereas if it's on an unclassified, confidential but unclassified basis, then the security risk is much lower. So in a sense, the good news is that what CEOs are looking for isn't really the ultimate secrets of the UK government, but help reading the book.
Thank you, Ed. And Ed, I'd be really interested. How would you, if you were in charge of this, how would you set up a sort of a structure across government for the engagement with industry that actually took it a step on from where it is now?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. This is a very good question. So we're looking at the practical options on there. Well, first of all, I don't think we know what the absolute perfect solution is. The one thing in my premise I'd like to throw in there, though, is this is not a case that you've got big galumphing useless companies that don't know a thing and sharp intelligence-fed government. Analysts at JP Morgan were tracking what China was doing with especially targeting German photoelectric panel companies in 2009, 2010. A particularly wealthy hedge fund chap with an office on Trafalgar Square, when I was director of operations, said, how come UK government has not joined the dots? The China 25 policy is published. So actually they have a different perspective. We all have different perspectives. They're not right and they're not wrong. I would go back to my point about exercises and experimentation. I think before we decide what the solution is, we run a few scenarios and we work them and talk them through. There can be tabletop exercises, with companies through a range of plausible scenarios, and then you work back. You do like the pre-mortem. Now, why did this fail? What is it that we didn't do? And we'll probably find that we're not doing a lot of those things at the moment. And then you would think through, just as Elisabeth has said. I'm always struck how many people, well-connected people, know things that when I've done certain jobs in the MOD, I knew because I read files. And of course, it's only because the government has found them out through certain means and it's protecting sources. It's amazing, what journalists or industry or academia or others and people, especially those who understand the street in another country, have gleaned. So I think there are mechanisms by which you can pull that together. And I do think that nexus of reserves, Paul O'Neill's asked a good question. There is a nexus there by which you can start to build some of that trust, and I do address some very good questions. Madeleine Moon, has raised another good one. And I would say, yes, whereas you look at the FTSE 100, very many of the CEOs might not be in the front of the queue for UK DV clearance for the reasons Elisabeth has outlined. That's not always going to be necessary, but go one or two levels down to the practitioners in the country, those actually managing cybersecurity, et cetera, and you'll probably find that those are UK nationals. So I think there are ways around this. I think we need to explore it through exercises, and those need to test some of the experimentation. Elisabeth, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to add that, Madeleine, I think somebody else made an excellent point about what you do about companies that have foreign owners. And yes, they may be based in the UK, and back during the Cold War, they were UK owned because most of our companies were nationally owned, and now they may have one owner or several owners based in other countries, including countries that are competing with us. That is the fundamental challenge of the globalized economy, and there is no answer to it other than to say that once there is a regular exchange between, in this case, the UK government and leading companies, then there is a basis of trust on which those CEOs and boards can make decisions. If there is no interaction, they will know, or very, very limited interaction. For example, when one of the government agencies delivers classified information regarding threats, if there is only very limited interaction, then that company will feel no obligation to take a decision in favor of the UK that may not make commercial sense at the moment. Whereas with regular interaction on the basis of trust with the government, at least that relationship is at the back of executives' minds when they make commercial decisions. And I think the UK would, and whichever other countries decide to do something like this, would have a better chance of steering corporate decisions or influencing them in a direction that at least wouldn't be harmful to the country.
So I'm going to, I want to sort of pull out, you both mentioned Madeleine Moon's question, and I want to pull out the second half of this, which I think, Elisabeth, you were talking about there, which is how do you engage not just the chief executives, but the operational frontline? How do you get the younger people involved? And this is obviously the concept behind the civilian reserves idea, which is essentially you have a group of people out there in the world who are experts in their own particular area, who are a part of the national effort. Clearly, that's at the moment under consideration, and it needs to be thought through how that will work in practice. And clearly, if it goes ahead, then they'll think about that. But But also there's a question, isn't there, about, I mean, it's clearly the right thing to do to harness as much talent as possible, or also the talent that's unharnessed, that's within the civil service. But also I think it often gets talked about as being simply something you turn to when there is a crisis. And the bigger point here is government, there is a huge amount of capability that government is not drawing on in order to avoid a crisis, in order to just think ahead better, prepare better. Elisabeth, could you comment on that in more detail, how that would work?
Yeah, so there are lots of people in the UK, and the same thing is true in other countries, but I think especially in the UK, that want to help in case of a crisis. But at the moment, the only opportunities for them are with NGOs like the Red Cross and maybe in some local resilience forums. So how do you the objective should clearly be to establish a structure where there is training during calm periods, so that you have a pool of people to draw on with specific expertise in the crisis. And we saw during the early weeks of COVID what an enormous desire there is across the UK to help. And I think, was it 750,000 people signed up for the NHS Army straight away, and then they weren't even needed. I mean, only a small percentage was needed, and the rest sort of fell by the wayside. Well, imagine if they could be harnessed during calmer times, and then know what to do in a crisis, instead of just turning up and saying, well, here am I, give me something to do. And that would be something quite rudimentary because they wouldn't have any training. So the civilian reserve is an answer to so many questions, both on the supply and demand side, because there is demand for this expertise, and there is also supply of people who are willing to provide it, including these young professionals of both in technical and maybe manual professions, and more academic professions that across the country. Then the other thing is, so how can you incentivize employers so they willingly forego their employees in a crisis? And I think that's something that the military reserves have battled and struggled with for a long time, and some countries have better solutions than others. But I think the answer is to provide training that then to those employees that then that training then helps the companies themselves, and it's almost a badge of honor to have people trained by the government. And a good example is Finland, which has this national security course. It's not a civilian reserve, but it is a national defense course. And if you're selected for it and complete it, which is a competitive process, you get this lapel pin that people who have graduated wear proudly. Well, what if companies could show their shareholders and their clients and prospective clients that they have a number of people who are trained by the government, have graduated from this perhaps civilian reserve training, and have expertise that other companies' employees don't have.
Ed.
Yes, I want to go back to that idea of a wartime analogy, and what the integrated review says is we are now in a competition. And maybe I'm just a bit of a weirdo. I'm not saying I'm a weirdo, a misfit. I know that's got a certain currency that, yeah. But I was brought up, one of the formative reads was R.V. Jones's Most Secret War. And the names for me from that time of Lindemann and Tizard and Solly Zuckerman, Barnes Wallis, R.G. Mitchell, Whittle, are there front and centre just as much as any of the military leaders and commanders. And there was a sense of national effort. And I think we can go back to, I think people have realised now, especially this last year in the pandemic, now, I think as Mark Carlton-Smith said yesterday, people now know what strategic shock feels like. People are alive, I think, to this idea now of getting much more involved. And not just saying, I'm going on with my life, defence does its thing over here, or the government does its thing over here. And as a practical measure, thinking through, as Madeleine mentioned, the companies, who owns them, et cetera, we have got this idea, which I think government is going to be pushing at the G7, of the D10. This idea of the democratic nations coming together, so we won't find ourselves on the wrong side of a Huawei or a wine ban if you're Australia, et cetera, et cetera. Well, shared policies on security clearances for people working in the companies, because how many of those people working in those FTSE 100 companies actually come from the D10? I would suggest probably quite a significant number. And the military, as you know, we're the framework nation for the Joint Expeditionary Force with 9 North European countries. There are things you can do there, and we can learn from them. The Baltic countries and the Scandinavian countries have always been better at thinking through, as Elisabeth has said, national resilience. Well, we may be the framework nation, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from Finland and Estonia on this. And I think, therefore, there are ways that we can build trust, back to that 3 E's, that third one. We can build trust, and we can do it through things like the D10, where we start to share the way we are going and our practices and our trust in the way that we deal and merge the public and private sector together. So it is not being seen as either nationally a disadvantage or an advantage. And that strikes me as a policy win that seems attainable. It don't seem to me to have too many downsides to it.
Ed, can I just follow up on that with a question? Peter Ricketts said earlier, traditional Whitehall departments are deep in crisis management all the time, so nobody has time to do anything. And I recognise that, but it's also terrible, isn't it? Because it implies that you're actually never doing the proper thinking. You're always just managing the crisis. And the risk is that you might create a civilian reserve cadre who find it impossible, as business do, to engage with busy civil servants who are managing a crisis. Clearly, the MOD has been doing this for years. What are the lessons that you would draw from how the MOD has been able to engage with its reserves that might then apply to more broadly across different government departments, so things that they could learn about how to do it?
Yeah, thank you. Such a broad subject. And I think I will just refer back to what Laurie Friedman said about sometimes little things can make a big difference. One example, in trying to cut through from an integrated operating concept, which I'm assuming most of the audience on this call will know roughly what I'm talking about there, the military element, if you like, the integrated review. And moving to a very different way of operating, you get this idea of the valley of death, because you have the continuing fight over the next 5 minutes, and you have the fight over money, and you have the programme of record, which is a 10-year plan for every last halfpenny that the MOD has. And as Anne-Marie Trevelyan has said, the only thing harder than getting a new programme in is getting an old one out. And so what we want to do is imagine what the future force looks like, such that you now have a credible model. You can say, well, you can build this. So now all you've got to do is make the financial and operational risk decisions as to when you're going to move from one to the other. It's not an abstract chimera that's out there possibly in the future. Why do I mention that? It was reservists that drew it up for me. It was reservists, people who'd served in DCDC, people who had commanded the Special Group Military Intelligence, a reservist organisation. And they have a slightly broader view, and they had the time to sit down and think through, given the task, so what are we doing differently in 4 years' time, write it down as a series of vignettes, and then we'll just keep doing the so what, till we've described what the force looks like. And you can, I think, create small teams that can do that. So I was going to say is I think you can create small teams that do that. And actually the civil service has got more flexible management options, personnel management options than the military has with liabilities and what have you, because it can just go out and hire people. So I think there are opportunities there, and I think that blend of the specialists in, if you like, that idea of the civil service reserve with a small team of a few bright fast trackers can start to generate some think pieces about the future that will be disproportionately beneficial for the investment made.
And it struck, sorry Ed to have interrupted, but it just struck me when you were talking that this question about where government does its thinking, if part of that happens in the assessment bodies, then that's actually a neat place where you can interact with external expertise. So as you were saying, when the banks have analysis on China, how does that get into government thinking? Well, it would get in most cleanly if the reserves were interacting directly with assessment bodies, which already happens to a very limited extent through some academic exchange. But actually, if you were to say, we're going to include 20 people, civilian reserves in the JIO, who are going to bring financial and legal expertise, international legal expertise, you're significantly enhancing your ability to think, aren't you?
Yes, and I just two things. Elisabeth, I think from the body language, Elisabeth wants to dive in, so I'll be quick. I think might have been David Livingstone, I think it was Michael Gove talked about the legislation going through to protect companies. The think piece on that in integrated RUSI was written by those military reservists with the city background who had that insight. That got into the Prime Minister's weekend box and led to some of that thinking. Over my left shoulder, I've just realised there's a photo. It's from Wilton Park in April 2019 when we organised a conference at DG level across government to address exactly these questions. And you can have some very, under Mark Sedwill, we pulled it together for him. And it was, yes, discussing some of the geostrategic bits, but the last third was about how we use data together, share better and plan better. And the title of that conference was Fusion Doctrine Becoming Business as Usual, Not Crisis Management. And there was a great meeting of minds there. It saddens me that we haven't actually taken that forward as well as we might. I just think it's purely because COVID and the integrated review got in the way. Who helped me pull that together? A colleague from MI6. These what used to be great stovepipes in government, are breaking down all the time. And I think the new Sir Stephen Lovegrove, the new NSA, has a great opportunity here because there is a groundswell of opinion and desire to find a new way of doing business. Sorry.
I get the impression there's a groundswell of talent as well, which is desperate to be enabled in some way, that is stuck in a structure which is not enabling it necessarily to its best effect at the moment. Elisabeth, sorry, you wanted to.
Well, the point I was going to make is that exchange doesn't happen if the government comes asking for insights from the corporate frontline when it decides it needs those insights. But it happens if there are regular exchanges so that UK PLC feels they can trust the government with the information that it has and feels not incentivized, but happy to give that information away, because if it's just a matter of the UK government coming knocking once in a while, then why would privately owned companies even take the time to share any information or insights? And I think that is the whole of society approach. If it truly is whole of society on a daily basis, or at least on a monthly basis or something, a quarterly basis, then it will work in the crisis as well.
Thank you. I'm just looking through our questions, which are quite complicated questions, I think. I don't know if you've seen them, but there's a point here made by Malcolm Waugh, who says, about 10 years ago, Air Chief Marshal Sir Brian Burridge produced a very good model on partnering and cooperation and how you select the resources and organisations to meet integrated threats. And he called it zero sum, which he says he's happy to pass on to you, particularly Ed, if you're interested. And that model has been tested recently with the Federation of Small Businesses and X-Forces, for example. Are either of you aware of that already?
I wasn't. I point out that Brian Burridge is an ex-commandant of the Staff College as well, and also I think did quite a lot with Henley Business School. So he was actually one of the people who really did try and bring the public and private, especially industry, private sector together. I might know of it. I might not know it by that name, but I would also ask that to send it to my successor as well, who's actually in post at the moment. Can probably do something with it. But yes, I would be very, very, very happy to have a look.
Elisabeth. So, okay, here's a question which comes back to your question about rationalising, I think, Ed, which you talked about earlier. And we've been talking a lot about the civilian reserves, but let's go back to the question about the College for National Security and what it teaches and to whom. This is a slightly provocative question, but Ed, the description that you gave of the Defence Academy and RCDS seemed to cover a number of the areas where you would naturally think a College for National Security would also train. You then did, however, also mention a whole set of new skills that people in government need, which is about tech and data and how to be numerate. How is this going to work in practice? Is there room for something different in the middle? You know, how are they all going to relate to each other, do you think?
Thank you. No, Michael Gove at the start sketched the bounds here, and you know, it's not for me to say what the government's actually going to decide to do, but I think it is for me to sketch a possible way ahead. Now, unlimited resource, and you build a campus somewhere, and no doubt for various reasons you build it outside London now, and it would be all singing and dancing. I think it might be a little bit difficult to generate the flow through if you want to streamline civil service, because you just think of the standing faculty and student body that you'd need to justify that, and it might be difficult. But that's why I majored on online and remote learning, and I think, you know, it is those educational practices that are going to be the methodology of the National Security Academy. All I'm suggesting is that, and I believe the brilliant commandant down, and I say that very, very deliberately, Major General Andrew Rowe might have tuned into this. And Andrew's done 1-star and then 2-star down there, and is actually a PhD in his own right and an educationalist, and has really done a lot of work into this. And so, what the Defence Academy is a framework and an infrastructure in both an organisational and an academic sense. I mean, it awards qualifications. It knows how to do it. It knows how to work with the partners that Sir Lawrence has already mentioned, his own King's College London. If that then becomes a framework, you scale it from there, and you don't need that campus. So you can use the facilities. So you can use the facilities of the FCDO's own diplomatic academy, which, you know, friends of mine, Pete Jones, got up and running on a shoestring, really, because, you know, William Hague, I think it was, when he was Foreign Secretary, decided that he needed to put some of this back into the FCO, and I'd agree with him. Fantastic facilities there on Whitehall. I've mentioned some that the Defence Academy has, linkages to things like the Turing Institute. So what you do is you use the physical and virtual infrastructure we already have, and then you pull the knowledge that people like Andy Rowe have to how you do training needs analysis, and you construct courses, and then you make that available online, so you get educational interventions at the time and point of need. You know, I think Major General Rowe would tell you about some of the unsolicited letters he now has from people who he didn't know had pulled courses down from our website, and they've just written saying, "Thank you very much. You wouldn't believe how it's transformed my business." So I think there is a model there that scales. There's obviously going to be some resource behind scaling, but it's not going to be at the level that you're pouring significant fractions of a billion of concrete into a huge infrastructure. You're making better use. You talked about rationalizing, streamlining what is there already.
Elisabeth, do you have comments on that?
No, but I do have a comment on a question from Paul O'Neill in the Q&A, and he said, well, wouldn't it be better if everybody just used the existing military reserves and fed people into that structure? And so the point is that outside these elevated circles of people who work on Whitehall and possibly in main building, it's actually the thought of joining the military reserves is not that attractive, and in fact it's quite daunting and something that many of the people we want to bring in probably wouldn't consider. And so the moment something has military overtones, even if people are not opposed to the armed forces themselves, it's just like a different world. I'm an opera fan. Most people consider it completely unthinkable or daunting to darken the doors of the Royal Opera House, because it's so different. And it's the same thing, I think, with the armed forces. Whereas, and of course, in addition, some people do have philosophical objections to it, but they do want to be part of helping the country be resilient in a crisis, or create resilience so that a crisis doesn't occur in the first place. So I think while Paul's question makes sense on a logical basis, it just wouldn't be feasible for large parts of the UK population.
And I think you made a point earlier, we're a nation of volunteers the UK, and the question is just how you actually channel the volunteering enthusiasm into something that's actually useful and structured. So can I ask sort of again a similar question? So we've agreed that it needs to be useful and structured. Well, sorry, I said it has. How much organising is that going to require from government? And are you essentially going to need a new department for managing all of that new effort and engagement? Or does it sit within a department, or is it done in a sort of disaggregated way? Can you envisage how it would work in practice? Elisabeth first.
Yeah, so if I got to decide here on this conference, I would say he would sit in the cabinet office, because it's obviously the coordinating function of the government, and the point of a civilian reserve is that it should have experts in all kinds of areas, well, in every area that is considered strategic and vulnerable at the same time across UK society. And well, how would you set it up? I think actually there are resources, including RCDS and maybe the new college that's under consideration, that could be useful as the actual training place, just like the Finns do it. They have their national defense course they do it in person for 3.5 weeks, but it wouldn't have to be like that in the UK. But anyway, training, and then you go out and about and return to your life, and return for annual refresher training, and your employer pays your salary while you're doing those things, because it benefits the company to have that, people with that accreditation.
Right.
I absolutely by what Elisabeth said. My plea is to keep it small. Actually, the worst tendency of Whitehall, it never finds a process it doesn't love, and it can never jettison one. And we do need to streamline this. Let's look at some of the successes we've had. Those who are home office, and you're very much your old job, Suzanne. OSCT put together a very good data sharing system for getting ahead of the terrorism threat. When we had to look at counter ISIL and deal with both its propaganda wing and its finance, and I had reservists helping me chair meetings in the Treasury in Rome. When I joined the Air Force, no one told me I'd be chairing meetings in the Treasury in Rome. Because reservists who understood both the oil business and really difficult parts of international finance, dollar auctions, Iraq banks, and Hawala, were working out how ISIS was moving money around. These are not traditional skills you teach, but small teams have been pulled together by government and have worked really well in some real world cases. So what I think I'd pose this question to this audience: to what extent is government capturing its own lessons learned at the moment? Because all of these things were ad hoc processes that worked, and they worked across the traditional boundaries, but they tend to evaporate once the immediate crisis is gone and the old order is restored. So I think an ability for government to understand its own successes sometimes. I think we've all been in organisations where 6 months goes and suddenly realize everybody has changed. No one, the corporate memory is gone. So that's the sort of thing that Cabinet Office could do as well. Set up a sort of government lessons learned, and we've already discussed, haven't we, Laurie, with the Chilcot and all sorts of other bits and pieces. We shouldn't have to spend a couple of $100 million on the Chilcot inquiry to work out what we did and what we did right and wrong. And I think there's something there that government could do in the Cabinet Office to help with that assessment, and that would be really beneficial for government.
Thank you. Now, I've just been told that our next speaker is having difficulties joining, so we can go on a little bit longer if we like. So there are hopefully some more questions coming in, which is, Elisabeth, would you like to?
Yes, Paul O'Neill wrote saying that he apparently had, and it was trying to make a different point, but nonetheless, what I thought was his question. That's what I answered. Then just to emphasize a point that was made earlier, and with a specific sector in mind. So something that's happened in the past, over the past few years, is that China has been expanding its ports, and Chinese companies have been investing in European ports. And that's just an example of it's a globalized economy, right? And part of the trend within the shipping industry is that the mega freighters are getting bigger and bigger. But the point is that the shipping industry, for example, is an industry that would, I think, have useful insights from the UK government just as part of loading and unloading at various ports around the world every single day of the year. So, for example, I'm just thinking hypothetically, just in case anybody from China is listening in, I'm not suggesting this is happening, but what if it were to be the case that they were being denied loading and unloading slots at various ports? That's something that could indicate a larger trend and something that the UK government should be aware of. I'm not sure there is a reporting system like that, not just from shipping, but from all kinds of other companies, including shoe companies all of a sudden being denied a new lease at their facilities in China. So again, this regular engagement with industry would incentivize industry leaders to share those insights, not because the government came and legislated the sort of a mandatory reporting practice, but because it would be done on the basis of trust, and they would be getting information from the government that they would help them evaluate and analyze their own situations.
So, and it's actually because I have some experience. I remember in the counterterrorism area where you actually do have a very frequent conversation with people who are under threat, but it is, as you say, it's not being properly instrumentalized in the way that it might be, and of course not across a whole range of things. And one of the things that whichever industry we're talking to always said back is, this can be a two-way thing. We know a whole load of stuff that would be useful to government, we just don't know how to tell it to you, which brings me back to my question about plugging into assessment and analysis, because that's the shortcut. I'm going to, John Bew is having technical difficulties, and this will be a test for number 10's IT department. So I'm going to ask the question, Clive Foe has written in asking what Elisabeth and Ed would think of the UK Stabilisation Unit's Civilian Stabilisation Group as a model for what's being discussed. Are either of you familiar with that? Ed, do you want to? Yes, Ed.
I'm very familiar with the STABU, and both in my 2 jobs ago as ACGS Ops and my last job as, that's the Operations Director of the MOD at 2-star level, and as Director General Joint Force Development. And in fact, we found the money at risk when the MD decided, I think sensibly actually, not to fund as a standing headquarters. The full standing Joint Force headquarters are at 2-star Joint Expeditionary Headquarters for the full-scale warfighting. But the people we did pay for full-time were 5 or 6 members of what you might associated with the stabilisation unit, for the reasons already outlined. In that if you haven't built trust, if you haven't worked with these agencies, you cannot suddenly surge that trust and understanding when you deploy into a theatre. Whereas we reckoned we could probably at a pinch train lots of very good staff college, so they've got the education, they've got the shared bedrock of knowledge and what have you from 3DIV or the JFAC or the Maritime Group, and reinforce straightforward planners quite quickly. So I like the stabilisation unit. I think it's learned a lot of lessons from our operations, not just the obvious ones, stabilisation operations, but things such as in the Caribbean. And I think, yes, I think there is a model there that you could look at in other areas. It's a perfectly valid suggestion from Clive.
Elisabeth, I just was thinking that one thing would be useful to talk about in more detail until John Bew gets here is the grey zone exercises that you've mentioned in the research that you were doing. I think you said it was Czechoslovakia, and I think that was government and industry doing tabletop exercises. How did it work, and what were the lessons that we might draw from it?
Well, you're very timely. So they just did the first full-blown exercise last week, I think it was. And well, maybe on the next conference we can get the deputy minister who organized it or who led it to give a full report. But the point is that he and others realized that the Czech Republic, not Czechoslovakia, but the Czech Republic was vulnerable to all kinds of threats, as we all are, and that the government really didn't have any sort of relationship with industry. And now he happens to be a deputy minister of defense, so his obviously immediate interlocutors would be defense contractors, but the government wisely decided that it shouldn't be just an exercise for defense contractors and the MOD, but the Czech Republic PLC, or whatever label you might use, that it should be for all sectors, of ranging from food to telecoms. And so, well, how do you start? That was the challenge they faced in October when they started thinking about it, and they had no working relationships with companies, but they just started inviting them, having the sort of conversations that we have been discussing here, but on a more ad hoc basis, just to get this exercise underway, because otherwise companies would be a little bit maybe taken aback, having had very little contact, and then all of a sudden being invited to participate in this exercise. So they did that, and did it very quickly. So in January, they could do a pilot exercise, and it went extremely well. And to their surprise, companies were exceptionally willing to participate, which is really quite something in a country that doesn't have this history of total defense or societal resilience. And I think that's a very useful example for the rest of us, that if invited and given an opportunity, companies will seize that opportunity and will participate, not because it's their civic responsibility, maybe there's a little bit of that, but because it makes strategic sense for them. I mean, they want to be prepared. And then lo and behold, as this was underway in the Czech Republic, as we know, the Czech intelligence services established that the explosion that took place, was it 7 years ago at an arms depot, was conducted or was set off by 2 Russian agents. And so the Czech Republic expelled Russian diplomats, and Russia expelled Czech diplomats. And then the question is, well, what does the Czech government do next? Whatever they do next, Russia will obviously retaliate. But now they and the Czech Republic PLC has some sort of reassurance that at least a number of companies, meaning the number of companies that have been able to participate so far, that they know what to do should their sector be targeted.
Do you have a view on the grey zone exercises? You obviously believe strongly in the importance of exercise. Have you done them with companies?
Not directly with companies, but I certainly know that we were proposing two proposals. The first was to take some of the standard force testing exercises run in the MOD and actually test them not just against the high-end war fighting, but simulate. Very difficult to simulate grey zone, of course, in many ways. But people are working out how to do it, and we wanted to be in the van of that. But the second point was to say that we're very much also pushing for, and I think this has to be done across government, for there to be a culture of wargaming to be inculcated again, and for it to be able to be done quickly and on the cheap. We tend to make huge events of them. I think it's the British national disease to turn everything into a great exhibition. And then we only do them, and everyone's so exhausted we don't do another one for 4 years. The Australians invested a lot in their synthetic environment and ran 220 war games. That's one per working day, I think, the average year in the first year. And of course, no war game tells you all the answers, because they've all got faults and failures. They can only really give you views from one perspective. So you need to do lots of war games, take lots of perspectives, and therefore draw the insights. And that should feed that analysis brain that we spoke about earlier on in this presentation, and this morning's commentators mentioned as well. So because you can't perfectly model grey zone ops, a lot of it is trying to model other decision making, the way populations work. As I mentioned earlier on, single synthetic environment, we're doing our best to create emulation engines for all this. But if you do lots of war games from lots of perspectives, then eventually the obvious truths keep popping up, and the things that don't pop up at all are starting to point themselves out as maybe, you know, the areas that you probably don't need to worry about. But that would need a bit of a change of culture across Whitehall.
Yes, and thank you, because that brings us to this really important question about essentially whether you're looking for behavioural change or structural change, and the answer is possibly both. I remember my experience of doing exercises, counterterrorism exercises, the real value when the crisis happens is that you all know each other personally and you know what each other's role is and what to expect from each other. So it seems it's self-evident that you are creating behavioural change by going through the process of doing the exercise, and you can see the benefit then that you would get if you did that with industry and academia as well, that you basically have a much wider community who not only knew each other but understood what each other were trying to do and what their responsibilities were. Ed.
I know I might be scratching one of your itches here, Suzanne, forgive me, but I also think that in the data-driven age, we need to move beyond the great man theory of leadership, because there is an element in all professions, name them, of I've paid my dues and I've learned by experience. But we've all been managing ignorance to some extent in the past. And what you should be able to do now with data and crunching it and modelling is to throw up counterintuitive solutions. A different sort of leadership required to deal with counterintuitive solutions. And it's not the heroic school of leadership or charismatic school of leadership that maybe has tended to dominate in quite a few of our institutions in the past. And only through exercising will you get to that, and then you're going to need to have to look at incentives. So I'm not saying that cultural change is easy, but I think it is very, very necessary, because I think we are on the cusp of one of those really big shifts that will demand cultural change, and we should set out to do it deliberately. After all, the worst that can happen is we find out that we were right all along. Wouldn't that be great?
Elisabeth.
So I have a humble suggestion that maybe the next exercise, the first exercise of the kind we're describing should be with PPE companies and providers of other vital supplies, because we have discovered collectively what happens when their supplies don't arrive or when they're disrupted, and considering that the next pandemic may be more devastating than this one, and that there could be other disruptions to supply chains, that may be a relevant and even urgent exercise to start with.
Thank you, Elisabeth. I've just seen that John Bew has arrived in Pamela Dow's room and is ready to broadcast. So I would like to say a huge thank you to Elisabeth Braw and Marshal, Ed Stringer, for your contribution beyond the call of duty with your extra minutes.